Story 1. The Road. My name is Thomas. I was born and raised in Leipzig, and for the past 20 years I've been driving trucks across Europe. These trips are usually predictable. Load up, drive, unload. The road is typically quiet, especially at night. That night, the one I'll never forget. I was hauling construction materials from Poland to Germany. The weather wasn't great. Rain had been pouring since morning and the highway was as empty as usual. I'd been driving for several hours when it felt like the air around me started to thicken. The rain pounded against the windshield and wet leaves flashed in the beam of my headlights. A dark forest stretched along the side of the road, almost pitch black in the downpour. The wind rustled the branches, but it seemed like the entire forest had frozen. Only my truck kept moving, cutting through the heavy rain. The clock read about midnight when I saw something flash by up ahead, right on the edge of the road. At first, it was just a vague silhouette, barely visible through the rain and the shadow of the trees. I thought it was just a person, maybe a traveler who had lost their way. But as I looked closer, I noticed that the figure was too large to be a person. Its head was disproportionately big, and its legs were too long, bent at the knees like an animal's. Its movements were odd. It swayed slightly from side to side as if it were off balance. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to focus on the road. Whatever it was, I knew better than to stare at strange shapes on a night highway. I pressed harder on the gas, eager to leave that spot behind. But a few kilometers later I felt a light bump, like something had hit the back of the truck. My heart started racing. I glanced in the rearview mirror but saw nothing. I pulled over at the next gas station and got out to check the truck. No damage. Still, the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. The gas station was quiet. I grabbed a coffee and sat by the window, trying to calm down. The rain was still falling, but not as hard. I was staring at the empty road when I saw the figure again. This time closer. It stood still, illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. My heart stopped. I could make out fur, hanging in matted clumps. This wasn't a person. The creature stood on two legs, but its movements, its form, the hairy chest, and its long, wolf-like arms were unmistakably inhuman. The coffee cup froze in my hands. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The figure was overtaken by some animal traits, as though it didn't belong to this world. Its massive head, barely showing any ears, resembled that of a wolf. It swayed slowly and took a step forward. I knew I shouldn't move, but panic took over. I stood up, threw some money on the counter, and rushed for the door. By the time I got outside, the creature was already closer. Now I could see it clearly. It was enormous, nearly as tall as my truck. Its arms were too long, with claws at the ends of its fingers. I froze, unsure of what to do next, and then the creature suddenly lunged forward. Its movement was strange. It ran on two legs, but with each step it began to change. At first it was a dogman, a terrifying thing, part human, part wolf. But slowly, right before my eyes, its form started shifting. I couldn't look away. Its legs shortened, its body hunched over, and soon it wasn't running anymore but moving like an ordinary dog, a large black dog. It dashed past me, disappearing into the dark around the bend in the road. Standing there in the rain, I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. The creature that had been half human, half beast had transformed into a regular dog right in front of me and vanished. I didn't stay long. The rain was intensifying and the wind howled, making it sound like there were hundreds of voices around me. I climbed into the cab, started the engine, and drove off. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely concentrate on the road. The rest of the journey I didn't stop, constantly glancing around. But I saw nothing more. When I finally arrived and unloaded the cargo, I sat in the truck for a long time trying to make sense of what had happened. I wanted to convince myself that it was a trick of the light, that I was just tired and scared by the dark. But I knew what I had seen. I never told anyone. No one would have believed me anyway. But every time I drive down a road at night, I think back to that night, always looking over my shoulder, hoping not to see that creature again. Story 2, Friend. That evening I was heading home later than usual. The forest was quiet and the cold air seemed to cling to everything. It had been a tough day, several miles of walking through hilly terrain, and I could feel the exhaustion in every muscle. Fog lay over the road, wrapping everything in a milky shroud. All I wanted was to get home, make myself some dinner, and finally relax after the long day. But as I turned onto the country road, I noticed something strange ahead. At first, it was just a vague blur in the fog. But as I got closer, it started to take shape. It was a dog lying by the side of the road. Its massive body, covered in dirty, matted fur, looked emaciated. The fur was clumped with blood, the wounds fresh, and its breathing was labored. I stopped a few feet away. The dog noticed me, bristling and growling. A low rumble came from its throat, warning me to keep my distance. Its eyes, filled with pain and fear, were locked on me. "Easy, easy," I whispered, trying to keep my voice as soft as possible. I didn't want to leave him there, in the middle of the road. But I was also afraid to get too close. His reaction was too unpredictable. Slowly, I crouched down, trying to show that I meant no harm. For a few minutes, we just stared at each other. The dog kept growling but didn't move. He was too weak to attack, and I felt a pang of pity for him. Deciding to take a risk, I pulled an old jacket from my backpack, the one I wore to keep out the cold wind. Slowly, step by step, I approached the dog, keeping low and trying not to make any sudden moves. He watched me warily, but his growl softened. Finally, I carefully wrapped the jacket around him and lifted him. Heavy but limp, he only flinched once when I set him on his feet, then went still. He didn't care anymore. His strength was gone. By the time I carried him home, it was completely dark. The house, which had once felt cozy, now seemed empty. My wife's death a few years ago had left me alone, and though time had passed, her loss still weighed on me. I went through each day, but rarely felt anything close to joy or the desire to care for someone else. The dog turned out to be what filled the void in my days. He lay at my feet, breathing heavily, and I kept watching as he slowly recovered. His wounds healed bit by bit, but it was a long and painful process. I had never experienced such a deep sense of responsibility for anyone since my wife's death. It started small, morning walks, feeding him, tending to his wounds. At first, the dog remained wary, often bristling or growling if I got too close. Sometimes I saw something wild, almost dangerous in his eyes, but it would fade as soon as I spoke to him in a soft voice. The dog was large, his breed a mystery, but one thing was clear. He wasn't a typical stray. There was something in his movements that hinted at the wild, something that kept him from fully trusting humans. Still, he began to accept my presence. Gradually, he stopped growling at me, started following me around the house, and even looked me in the eyes as if he wanted to say something. The lonely days stretched on slowly, with time blurring into a monotonous routine. The dog became part of that routine, filling the emptiness I'd felt since my wife died in a car accident. I began to see him not just as an animal, but as a companion who shared the quiet of the house with me. A few months ago, I never could have imagined finding the strength to care for anyone again. My wife's death had left a deep wound in my soul, and I had stopped seeking comfort or company. But this dog, who appeared so unexpectedly, began to ease that pain. Every time he came closer, watching me, I felt a little lighter. Soon I started noticing something strange. The dog was too smart for a regular dog. He learned quickly, understood commands I hadn't even spoken aloud. Sometimes it felt like he was reading my thoughts, anticipating my actions. It was almost unreal. I tried not to give it much thought, chalking it up to luck. Maybe I had just found a really smart dog. But each day, my doubts grew. The dog's behavior was too deliberate, as though he was studying me, analyzing my habits. Sometimes I caught his gaze and it made me uneasy. There was something human in those eyes, something too intelligent for an animal. I tried to brush off the thoughts, but those moments stuck in my memory. Months passed, and my life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. The dog and I spent our days together. I worked, and he quietly followed me around the house, watching my every move. Despite the strangeness in his behavior, I had grown used to his company and couldn't imagine my life without him. He had become a friend. One night, I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but soon realized someone was trying to break the lock on the front door. I had barely managed to get out of bed when the door burst open with a loud crack, and two masked men stormed into the house. They quickly grabbed me, tied me up, and began rummaging through my things. "Sit still, and nothing will happen," one of them said, leaning in close to me. I tried to resist, but I didn't have the strength. They tore through the house, turning everything upside down. It didn't seem like they found anything valuable, yet they kept searching. That's when I realized the dog was gone. The house was eerily quiet, with only the occasional sound of the intruder's footsteps echoing around me. Suddenly, one of the men stopped and turned to the other. "Where's the dog? Did you see him?" The other shrugged. "Gone. Maybe he ran off." But in that moment, I understood that the dog hadn't run away. He was hiding somewhere. Soon I heard a faint rustling and saw my dog appear in the doorway. He stood in the shadows, his eyes glinting in the darkness. He didn't charge at the men, didn't make a sound, but his presence was palpable. He watched their every move intently. One of the men noticed him and pulled out a gun. "We need to get rid of him," he said, aiming at the dog. But just as he raised the gun, the dog vanished. I barely had time to see him dart to the side, disappearing into the shadows. The burglars started to panic, nervously glancing around. It felt like the dog was toying with them, luring them into a trap. A rustle from the other side of the house made one of the men step into the hallway. In that instant, the dog sprang at him, knocking him to the ground. The man screamed, his weapon flying out of his hands while the dog sank his teeth into his arm with furious intensity. The other burglar rushed over to help, but it was already too late. The dog moved swiftly, almost as if he had planned every step. He didn't attack head-on. Instead, he used the dark corners and narrow hallways of the house to catch the intruders off guard. The second man didn't even have time to react when the dog leapt at him from the shadows, knocking him down as well. One of the men tried to make a break for it, but the dog didn't give him a chance. He intercepted him at the door, taking him down to the floor, and then disappeared again. A menacing silence settled over the house, broken only by the ragged breathing of the remaining burglar. Finally, the dog came back to me. He slowly approached and began chewing through the ropes around my wrists, carefully freeing me. When he was done, he quietly walked over to the table where my phone was lying, picked it up in his mouth, and brought it to me. His eyes were filled with meaning, too intelligent for those of an ordinary animal. I dialed the police. When they arrived, one of the burglars was dead, the other unconscious, and my dog was gone. I tried to find him, but he was nowhere to be seen, neither in the house nor outside. The next morning, I searched the entire neighborhood, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. He had left. I couldn't fully grasp what had happened that night, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a dog. Maybe it was some kind of creature from legends, intelligent and dangerous, but one that had saved me. I felt hollow, like I had lost a friend. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that he hadn't left for no reason. Maybe he knew there was a greater threat to me than those burglars. Perhaps he had gone to protect me from a danger I hadn't yet realized. I hoped that one day he would return, just as he had come when I needed help the most. Sometimes when the fog rolls into the city or the wind whispers softly at my window, I feel like he's still nearby. I sense his presence. My friend is watching over me, guarding me just like he did that night. Story 3, Quadrobics. I met her by chance in the school cafeteria. She walked up to me while I was sitting alone looking at my phone. She stood out. Long blonde hair, green eyes, and a confident stride. We started talking at first about small things. Then she mentioned she practiced quadrobics. Quadro what? I asked, not understanding. Quadrobics, she said with a smile. It's a sport where we imitate the movements of animals. Dogs, wolves, foxes. We have a group. We're like a pack. We jump, run, and act like animals to study their instincts. I smiled, thinking she was joking, but there wasn't a trace of humor in her eyes. Her name was Lisa, and I was surprised that someone who seemed so sweet and friendly could be into something so strange. But I liked Lisa. She was different from the other girls at school. We started spending more time together. At first, our conversations were about regular topics. Movies, music, school gossip. Lisa was a nature lover, and her interest in animals seemed genuine. Over time, she brought up quadrobics again. We have our own pack, she said one day while we were sitting in the park. Everyone picks an animal. I'm a wolf. You should join us. I didn't take it seriously. Pretending to be animals? It sounded ridiculous. But the more I got to know Lisa, the more I liked her, and I didn't want to disappoint her. The idea seemed strange, but why not give it a try? Besides, it was an excuse to spend more time with her. Weeks passed, and I kept putting off joining. We went for walks, talked, and she slowly drew me into her discussions about quadrobics. I realized it was important to her, more than just a game. One day she invited me to a night meeting with her friends. Come with us, she said. We're having a game. I'll introduce you to the alpha. If you want to be my boyfriend, you'll have to meet the leader of our pack. Her statement made me a little uneasy, but I didn't show it. We met at the park late at night, and a few more people joined us. They were all dressed in strange clothing, animal costumes, masks, tails, ears. They looked eerie, especially in the darkness of the night. I felt uncomfortable, but Lisa acted as if everything was normal, which put me at ease. We started jumping and running in circles, imitating animals. Surprisingly, it wasn't as strange as I'd thought. It felt like childhood games, but with a more serious tone. Lisa leaped around, growling and laughing, her eyes gleaming with excitement. I tried to get into character too, even though it all felt absurd to me. After a while, Lisa said it was time to meet the Alpha. "Are you ready?" she asked. I nodded, though a sense of unease was growing inside me. We went deeper into the woods, towards an old abandoned construction site. There, a tall man in a black mask with sharp wolf-like teeth was waiting for us. "This is our Alpha," Lisa introduced him. He came closer, looking me up and down. There was something unsettling in his gaze, almost primal. "If you really want to be part of quadrobics," he said, "you'll need to pass a test. You'll have to join the hunt." The Alpha spoke calmly, but there was something terrifying in his voice. Lisa was watching me expectantly, as if this moment meant a lot to her. I hesitated. I liked Lisa, but something inside told me this wasn't right. Still, I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I nodded, agreeing to the hunt. "Good," Alpha said with a smirk. "Follow us." We moved deeper into the forest. The night was dark, the air cold, and the fog curling along the ground added to my growing sense of dread. There were 5 of us, me, Lisa, Alpha, and 2 others from their pack. They moved silently, almost like animals themselves, slipping through the shadows of the trees. They were graceful and coordinated, like a pack of wolves stalking their prey. After a few minutes, we stopped. Alpha raised his hand, signaling us to be still. Ahead in a clearing, I saw a figure. It was a man, dirty, thin, with torn clothes. From the looks of him, he was homeless. He sat on the ground, leaning on an old crutch, completely unaware that he was being watched. "This is our prey," Alpha whispered, his eyes glowing in the darkness. "If you want to be one of us, you have to take part." I froze, trying to process what was happening. This didn't feel like a game anymore. These people were serious. I looked at Lisa, hoping to see doubt in her eyes, but she seemed captivated by the situation. There wasn't even a hint of hesitation in her gaze. "This is wrong," I whispered. "We can't. He's a person." Lisa didn't respond. She kept staring at the homeless man, her body tense, as if she were about to pounce on him. Alpha flashed a predatory smile and gave the signal. They began to move. They moved almost like animals, on all fours, their steps silent. I watched as they circled the man, resembling a pack of wolves more and more with each passing second. At that moment, I felt real fear. This wasn't the quadrobics I had imagined. This was a real hunt. I took a step back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from what was happening. Lisa growled, her movements sharp, and she no longer looked like the girl I had befriended. The others growled too, making strange sounds that were more beastly than human. And then, all at once, they attacked the homeless man. He screamed but didn't have time to react. They grabbed him, surrounding him from all sides. Alpha stood back, watching as his pack closed in on their prey. I saw Lisa latch onto the man first, but her face, it had changed. It no longer looked human. Her face had elongated, her eyes had darkened, and her jaw seemed wider and stronger. Horrified, I rushed toward Lisa, trying to stop her. I grabbed her by the shoulders and shouted, "Lisa, stop!" She whipped around to face me, and at that moment I saw her face. It wasn't human. Her features were distorted. Her eyes glowed yellow, and strange patches covered her skin, as if she was turning into something else. She growled at me, and for a split second I thought she was going to attack me too. I grabbed for her mask, hoping this was just part of the game, that she was only pretending. But when I ripped it off, I realized this wasn't a game. Her face had truly changed. Lisa wasn't who she seemed to be. She was no longer human. Panicking, I stumbled backward and ran. My feet caught on the roots of trees, but I didn't stop. I could hear growling behind me, but I didn't dare look back, terrified that she might chase me. It was only when I broke out of the woods that I allowed myself to stop and catch my breath. Since that night, I've avoided Lisa. I've seen her at school a few times, but she never tried to talk to me again. I didn't know what it had been, a game, something supernatural, or just madness. But one thing I knew for sure, I never wanted to see Lisa or her pack again. Story 4. Revenge. It started to drizzle as I pulled up to the house at the edge of the village. The old home stood almost in the forest, surrounded by ancient trees whose crowns loomed over the roof, as if shielding it from prying eyes. A week ago, the bodies of an elderly couple, Jan and Maria Kowalski, were found here. Their deaths had seemed strange. No signs of robbery, but clear evidence of a violent struggle. When I entered the house, everything inside looked ordinary. Cluttered, dusty furniture, old photographs on the walls. But the feeling... something had been pressing down on me from the moment I arrived. The air was heavy, thick with mildew and something else. Something indescribable. I knew something had happened in this house. Something beyond reason. In the next room, Jan's rifle lay untouched, a hunting weapon that hadn't been used in months, judging by the layer of dust. For a hunter, this was odd. The village had spoken of Jan as a devoted hunter, someone who went into the forest every day while his health allowed. But something had changed, and he stopped hunting shortly before his death. I began to dig into their past. Everything pointed to Jan Kowalski, harboring dark secrets related to his last hunt. Months ago, he had boasted to the locals about finding 2 large wolves in the forest. He had proudly claimed that he killed their pup and had shown off his trophy. No one had taken him seriously at the time. But now I started to have doubts. My intuition told me that something wasn't right. The locals mentioned that after the incident with the wolf pup, Jan had begun avoiding the forest. He seemed troubled, often staring out the windows and never letting his rifle out of reach. Yet, when death came for him, the gun was left unused. The next day, I decided to venture into the forest where, according to rumors, Kowalski had loved to hunt. The forest felt alien. With each step, branches cracked beneath my feet, and the fog thickened. My hand instinctively reached for the flashlight in my pocket. I had the unsettling feeling that something was watching me, though the world around me was still. After walking several kilometers, I stumbled upon a clearing. It was unnaturally quiet here, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. In the center of the clearing were remnants of a fire and torn bits of animal hide. They looked old, but around the edges of the tracks, there was something fresh, as if a beast had just been there. I looked around and suddenly noticed enormous paw prints leading deeper into the forest. These weren't wolf tracks. They were larger, heavier. I started to wonder what kind of animal could have left such prints. No known creature could be this massive. My sense of dread grew with each step. I followed the tracks to a ravine, and there, in the thick fog, something appeared ahead of me. At first, it was just a dark silhouette. It stood motionless as if watching me from afar. I froze, realizing that this wasn't a human. The figure was too tall, almost inhuman. Slowly, as if rising from the earth itself, a dense mist began to swirl. In its movement, I saw the creature begin to change. At first, I thought it was a wolf, but its legs were too long, its claws too sharp and large, and its movements too fluid for an animal. The creature turned slowly and vanished into the fog. I stood there, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Whatever it was, it seemed so unreal that my mind struggled to process it. A cold weight settled in my chest, and without hesitation, I decided to return to the village. On the way back, the fog thickened, and every step felt heavier. As I approached the old Kowalski house, I had the distinct feeling that I had missed something important. That day left me with many questions and only one answer. Something connected to the creature I had seen in the forest. But how was it tied to the deaths of the elderly couple? Reaching the village, I decided to inspect the house again. The rain had intensified, and when I opened the door, the stale air rushed out to greet me. I made my way to the room where they had been found. I had already looked around this place before, but now I searched for signs with a new perspective. Everything pointed to an attack, but by whom? My attention was drawn to faint claw marks on the floor, which I hadn't noticed the first time. They stretched from the door to where the bodies had been, as if something massive had entered the house. I crouched closer. The marks were deep, uneven, as if made by sharp claws. Then I saw scratches on the windowsill, where the Kowalskis must have tried to defend themselves. Panic, terror. It was all obvious now. They had known what was happening. But why? Looking around the room further, I found something that stopped me cold. In the corner, under the table, lay a torn pelt, resembling the hide of a wolf pup. I remembered the rumors in the village. Kowalski hadn't just killed a wolf. He had killed something more. The entire village had laughed at his tales. But now, those ridiculous stories about unknown wolves seemed to be true. I started piecing together the events. John Kowalski had bragged about killing 2 large animals and their pup. And now that creature had come back for him. Revenge. It hadn't returned for prey. It had come for the one who took its offspring. Standing in that house, I realized that this revenge wasn't random. This wasn't an ordinary animal protecting its territory. This creature had come deliberately, with purpose. And its goal was clear: to destroy the one who had upset the balance. I looked at the remaining tracks and the remnants of the pelt and understood that my encounter with the creature in the forest hadn't been a coincidence. It had been the final warning. It hadn't attacked me because its mission was complete. The hunt was over. I stepped out of the house, feeling that the mystery had been solved. The deaths of the elderly couple, the slain pup, the creature, it all fit together in one terrifying puzzle. This had been revenge, pure and cold, and it had found its target. Story 5. The Missing. It happened several years ago, but I still remember that day as if it were yesterday. My nephew Yosef and I had decided to head into the forest behind the village, as we had done many times before. We often did this, especially in the summer. Lydia, my sister and Yosef's mother, had always been against these long hikes, especially without her, but the boy loved exploring the forest trails behind the house. She couldn't refuse him, and I never saw any danger in it. The morning of that day seemed like any other. The village was as it always was. People working in the fields, a few children playing by the stream, and the quiet of the mountains giving a sense of peace. Yosef and I set out around noon, planning to spend the whole day in the forest. The air was cool and the leaves rustled slightly in the gentle breeze. But with each step deeper into the woods, the atmosphere changed. At first, It was the usual kind of silence you experience when you venture far into the forest. But soon I noticed this forest was too quiet. As we hiked further into the mountains, the silence grew more and more unsettling. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. I thought maybe it was because we were tired. We had already walked several kilometers, and the mountain air felt heavier than usual. But as we approached the trail leading to the abandoned hunting cabin, I realized something wasn't right. Yosef slowed his pace, glancing around as if he had heard something. "Everything okay?" I asked him, but he just nodded. There was a strange tension on his face, as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. We continued, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept looking around, sensing that something was watching us from the trees. When we reached the cabin, a chill ran down my spine. The place felt dead. It had always looked old and run down, like you'd expect from an abandoned spot. But now it seemed like everything around it had withered away. The grass was scorched, the trees were blackened, and there was a faint smell of rot in the air. Yosef stopped and stood still, listening intently. His face had turned pale, and he said nothing. That's when I heard it too. A rustling in the bushes, barely audible but disturbingly close. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. I thought maybe it was just an animal, a fox or even a deer, but the sound was too heavy for a small creature. "Yosef, stop! Don't go over there," I said quietly. But it was as if he couldn't hear me. The boy took a step forward, entirely focused on whatever was happening in the bushes. I rushed after him, but my legs felt like they were weighed down, and every movement was a struggle. We found ourselves in a small clearing surrounded by trees, and it seemed like the forest itself was closing in on us, not letting us leave. I got closer to Yosef, and then we both froze. On the far side of the clearing, in the shadows of the trees, stood something. At first I couldn't make out what it was, but when it stepped forward, it became clear that this was no ordinary animal. The creature was enormous, on all fours, with matted fur hanging in clumps, and its eyes glowed with a faint yellow light. I stood paralyzed, unable to understand what I was looking at, but every fiber of my being screamed that we were in danger. This was something I couldn't explain. Its paws were huge, and its movements were quick but unnaturally fluid for any normal beast. "Yosef, back away!" I shouted, but my voice seemed to disappear into the oppressive silence of the forest. Yosef didn't move, as though he were mesmerized by the creature. I wanted to push him out of the way, but I couldn't move either, as if my feet were glued to the ground. The creature slowly advanced. With every step it grew larger, its massive claws sinking into the earth, leaving deep impressions. Suddenly, Yosef bolted forward, not understanding what he was doing. I ran after him, but terror stopped me in my tracks. I had never felt fear like this. It wasn't just the fear of a wild animal. It was something ancient, something beyond reason. When I reached the spot where Yosef had been standing, he was gone. The creature had vanished too. Only the paw prints and tufts of fur remained on the grass. I screamed his name, running through the clearing, searching for any sign of him, but found nothing. Time lost all meaning. It felt like hours had passed, but I kept running through the forest, calling for him. But the forest remained eerily silent and cold. When I finally made it back to the village, I was soaked, filthy, and exhausted. I didn't know how to tell Lydia that her son had disappeared, but I knew one thing. Yosef was gone. That creature had taken him, dragged him deep into the forest, where I couldn't follow. I returned to the forest several times after that, searching for signs, but found nothing. Lydia eventually stopped believing he would come back. The locals said it was forest spirits or demons, that sometimes they take people who wander too far. But I knew it wasn't a spirit or a demon. It was something else, something that had been watching us from the shadows. I still feel its presence whenever I walk that path. It hasn't left, it's just waiting for the next step, ready to appear again. Story 6. She's Near. Since mid-November, cold rains and thick fog had swallowed up our town. That evening, as usual, I stayed late at work. Patients came one after the other, the cold season in full swing. When everything was done, Anna suggested we meet at our favorite restaurant to unwind after a long day. The restaurant was almost empty. Outside, rain poured down and the streets were shrouded in thick fog. Anna and I talked about mundane things, never suspecting that this evening would change everything. By the time we left the restaurant, it was already late, well past midnight. The air was damp and heavy, and it felt like the fog was wrapping around us, pulling us into its shadow. Halfway home, I noticed something ahead of us. At first, it was just a dark figure, barely visible in the dim streetlights. I thought it was a stray dog, but the closer we got, the more I noticed that something was off. Its movements were stiff, and its fur was patchy, hanging in clumps. The fog distorted its outline, creating the illusion that the dog was changing shape. Anna gripped my hand tighter. We stopped, not daring to go any closer. The dog stood motionless, its eyes dull and cloudy like those of a sick animal. I wanted to walk around it, but suddenly the creature lunged at us. I didn't even have time to shout before it sank its teeth into Anna's leg. Blood immediately began soaking through her pants. I frantically tried to push the dog away, but it wouldn't let go, its bite deep and vicious. The dog disappeared into the fog as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving us in shock. Anna could barely stand. I helped her home, doing my best to stop the bleeding, cleaned the wound and bandaged it. But even then, something inside me wouldn't rest. This wasn't just a normal attack. The next few days were a nightmare. Anna began to change. She hardly slept, wandering the house at night, keeping me awake. I'd find her in the kitchen eating raw meat, even though she had always hated the smell of blood. Her eyes grew wild, her face tense, and sometimes it seemed like she didn't even recognize me. Weeks passed. Her condition worsened, and one night I came home after a long shift to find the house in chaos. The floors and walls were smeared with blood, and in the middle of the room lay a mutilated cat. Anna was nowhere to be found. I called the police, but the search turned up nothing. Months passed, and the hope of finding her slowly faded. Years went by. I still worked at the hospital, but my thoughts often returned to that night. Then, one day as I was walking home from work, the fog once again enveloped the streets. In the distance I saw a familiar figure. It was the same dog that had bitten Anna. It stood there, motionless, its eyes glowing faintly yellow, and something in its posture struck me as unnatural once more. I stopped, staring at the creature, and then I noticed another dog beside it. At first, I didn't pay much attention to the second dog. I was focused on the first. But as the fog swirled around them, I noticed the second dog begin to change. Its outline blurred and its legs grew longer, as if the creature were stretching. The first dog began to transform too. Before my eyes, they morphed into something humanoid, but with wolf-like features, dogmen. I didn't move. Fear surged through me, but I was paralyzed watching as the creatures transformed. Their eyes, glowing brightly through the fog, were filled with a savage cruelty. But they didn't attack. Instead, they slowly backed away, disappearing into the fog. I stood there, frozen, until I could bring myself to move again. When I returned home, thoughts of what had happened swirled in my mind. I remembered the first dog, the one that had bitten Anna, and I realized it was the same dog I had seen that night. But the second one, when I understood that it might have been Anna, a chill ran down my spine. I knew I had lost her forever. Now I know she didn't just disappear. She became one of them. And though my heart ached with sorrow, there was also a strange sense of relief in the realization. She hadn't vanished without a trace. She had changed forever, but she was still out there, somewhere close by, in this new form. Story 7. The Government's Task. I arrived in this small town at dawn. My special assignment from the government was to investigate the disappearance of a group of archaeologists who had gone missing 3 weeks ago. The reports mentioned 8 people who had simply vanished while excavating a remote part of the forest near the Polish border. The official files were scant on information, and all I had were a few photos of their camp and statements from the locals, none of which provided an answer to the main question: what had happened? The local authorities had tried to conduct an investigation, but after a few days, their efforts had stalled. The archaeologists' camp was found intact, undisturbed, but empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, just an empty site, as if the people had evaporated. That's when I was called in to solve the case. Mysteries like this had always been part of my job, but something about this story had unnerved me from the start. When I reached the village, my first goal was to talk to the locals. In small settlements like this, people always know more than they're willing to say, and my job was to extract the information they might prefer to keep hidden. Rural life is closed off and harsh, and only through careful observation and questioning could I hope to uncover the details. In the morning, I went to the village elder's house, the man who should have known more about the events than anyone. Gavril was a tall, gaunt man in his 50s, with a tense face and eyes that gleamed as if he was constantly hiding something. We sat on a bench in front of his house as I asked him questions about the camp and the missing archaeologists. "This place has always been quiet," he began, staring off into the distance. "People here live modestly. The forest is old and strange things happen there. Things that can't be explained." "What do you mean?" I asked, already sensing that he was hinting at something important. "The forest isn't ordinary. They say there's something there that was meant to stay forgotten. The archaeologists came to dig, to find bones and artifacts, but they found something more." His words were strange, but locals always love legends and mysteries. However, I wasn't quick to dismiss his claims. I had a feeling that this case involved more than just folklore. In my past investigations, stories like these often accompanied real events, merely hidden under the veil of superstition. I asked what people had been saying about the archaeologists. Gavril hesitated before continuing. "People saw them for the last time near the camp, the day before they disappeared. There was something odd about it. Some say they heard screams that night, but that's just rumors. No one dares go into the forest. It's cursed." I could see that he was nervous even though he tried to hide it. Something was off, and I needed to find out what. As I continued my questioning, I realized that the locals were holding back more than they were saying. The forest seemed to instill genuine fear in them, and they would rather not talk about what went on there. This was my first solid lead. I needed to examine the camp and the surrounding areas to figure out what might have scared or drawn the archaeologists. After speaking with the elder, I headed toward the archaeologists' camp. The locals reluctantly agreed to drive me to the trailhead that led into the forest, but from there I had to go alone. The path to the camp was rough and shrouded in fog. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more I felt a strange tension, as if the place itself was trying to stop me. When I reached the camp, the first thing I noticed was the silence. There were no forest sounds, no rustling leaves or bird song. The camp stood untouched, as if the people had just left for a few hours and were expected to return any minute. The tents, equipment, personal belongings, everything remained in place. But something about the scene felt unnatural. I slowly examined the area. The backpacks and tents were undamaged. There were no signs of a struggle or sudden flight. The feeling that the archaeologists had simply vanished grew stronger with each passing minute. I opened one of the tents and found a notebook left behind by one of the archaeologists. It was a field journal, with the last entry made shortly before the disappearance. The journal spoke of strange discoveries. Old artifacts buried deep beneath the earth, belonging to an ancient culture. Among them was a carved amulet depicting a wolf-like creature. The archaeologist described how this find stood out from everything they had previously unearthed. He mentioned strange tracks near the camp, as if someone or something had been walking through the forest, watching them. These words made me tense. I continued searching the site and came across an old map of the area, marking an ancient burial site several kilometers from the camp. It seemed the group had planned to visit this place, but something stopped them. They knew something was wrong with this location. As I pondered all of this, I heard a faint rustling again. The forest was finally coming alive with sound, but not the kind I expected. These were strange footsteps, as if someone was slowly walking among the trees, staying just out of sight. I froze, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise, but I saw nothing. The tension was growing. The forest began to feel alive. The shadows between the trees thickened, and I suddenly felt as though I was being watched. Yet despite the overwhelming sensation, there was no one around. After spending a few more minutes in the camp, I decided it was time to return to the village. I needed to study the archaeologist's notes and understand what they had found before drawing any conclusions. As I emerged from the forest, the local man who had waited for me at the trailhead looked at me anxiously. "Did you find anything?" he asked, as if already knowing the answer. "Not yet, but something strange," I replied, trying not to stir up any unnecessary fear in him. On the way back, I mulled over everything I had seen. The journals and the artifacts held the key to this mystery. Perhaps the archaeologists had uncovered something that was never meant to be disturbed, something ancient and dangerous. These thoughts haunted me. Upon returning to the village, I decided that my next step was to thoroughly examine the archaeological records. I needed to understand what exactly had drawn their attention to this place. Back in the village, I went straight to the house where I was staying. I spread out the archaeologist's notes and the map I had found in the camp on the table. Gavril's words about the forest curses and the villagers' fears echoed in my mind, but I was more focused on the facts. What had the archaeologists discovered that could have led to their disappearance? The last entry made by Lessig, one of the archaeologists, kept bothering me. "We woke them." These words were too vague to understand whom or what they had woken. The archaeologists were not superstitious people. They dealt in facts. But this journal was filled with strange and disturbing references. They had found traces of large creatures in the forest, unlike any known animals. Leszek mentioned hearing strange sounds at night, but the team had laughed it off. I flipped through the journal and came across another passage, a description of the wolf-like creature depicted on the ancient amulet. This being resembled figures from Slavic myths, legends of werewolves who guarded their lands. Could it be that the archaeologists had crossed the boundary of something ancient without realizing what they were dealing with? My thoughts were interrupted by light footsteps outside the door. I jumped but quickly calmed down. It was the village elder, bringing me more news. "I thought you should know," he said, sitting down across from me. "The night before they disappeared, the archaeologists saw something in the forest. Local boys, out picking berries, said they heard screams from the camp. Then the screams stopped. That heavy feeling returned, the sense that this story was hiding something far more sinister than just missing people." The elder stared at me intently, as if waiting for my response. "This is important. Do you know anything else?" I asked, trying to coax more information from him. He shook his head, but his gaze told me he knew more than he was letting on. I was beginning to realize that the locals were afraid of something. Perhaps they knew more about the forest legends than they were willing to admit. The next morning I decided to return to the forest, but not to the camp. I planned to visit the ancient burial site marked on the archaeologist's map, the place where something unexpected might have occurred. I wanted to delve into these ancient legends, but I knew I needed solid evidence to form a complete picture. When I reached the location, it was shrouded in fog, as if something was hiding it from view. The burial ground looked ancient, crumbling, overgrown with moss and grass. Suddenly, I thought I saw movement in the shadows of the trees. The feeling of being watched returned with renewed intensity. I stopped scanning the area but saw nothing. I moved closer and saw an old stone pillar with carved symbols, clearly belonging to ancient Slavic cultures. At the center was the image of the same wolf-like creature Leszek had written about. It looked menacing, as if it was meant to be a warning. Could the archaeologists have really awoken something that was supposed to remain forgotten? As I made my way back to the village, one thing became clear. These disappearances were no accident. The archaeologists had disturbed the peace of an ancient site, and something in the forest had come for them. I couldn't explain it rationally, but the reality of what I had witnessed was becoming increasingly undeniable. With that, my investigation in the village came to an end. I needed to return to the city and file my report, but the feeling that I hadn't uncovered all of the secrets of this place stayed with me. I knew that the ancient legends of werewolves might be true, and this forest held answers I had yet to find. Story 8. Witness Statement. Police Report. Date: October 13th, 2023. Location: Forest Road, outskirts of Bruges, Belgium. Victim: Laura Bennett, 36 years old. Occupation: nurse, St. Luke's Clinic. Condition: severe injuries, admitted to intensive care. Statement: recorded by dictation. The victim is in a state of shock. Testimony recorded at the Bruges police station, October 14th, 2023. I was returning home from my night shift as usual. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was driving down a road that cuts through the forest. At that hour, the road was always deserted. Rarely did any cars pass by. I often drove this way, and nothing unusual had ever happened until that night. As I approached a turn, my car suddenly jerked, and I realized I had a flat tire. I couldn't keep driving, so I had to pull over. I got out of the car with my flashlight to check the tire. It was completely flat. Annoyance and anxiety washed over me. The darkness around was so thick that the beam from my flashlight seemed like a thin thread barely cutting through the night air. I tried to get the spare tire out of the trunk, but everything seemed to be swallowed up by this fog. And then I heard the first rustling sound. It was barely noticeable, like something moving in the thick bushes by the roadside. I froze and listened, but there was silence. I decided it was just the wind and went back to dealing with the tire. But a minute later I heard it again, this time closer. I raised the flashlight and pointed it at the bushes. In the beam of light I saw shapes. At first I thought they were just regular dogs, but as they stepped out of the bushes, I realized they were something else. These creatures moved strangely. They were on all fours, but their bodies were longer, and their movements were too smooth and fast for ordinary animals. I froze in place as one of them came closer. It had a massive head with dull, glowing eyes. It stared at me, unmoving. Then, at some point, it stood up on its hind legs. It was a terrifying sight. This thing, which looked like a dog, standing like a human, staring at me without moving. I didn't know what to do, but slowly back away toward the car. I turned and ran for the door, but I didn't make it in time. These creatures had already surrounded me. They moved like wolves, silent, cautious, but with incredible speed. One of them jumped on me, knocking me to the ground. I felt its sharp claws dig into my shoulder. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I tried to fight back, but they were too strong. They kept grabbing at my legs and arms, growling and baring their teeth. I had never seen anything like it. They shifted between moving on all fours and standing on their hind legs, like they were both human and animal at the same time. Fear paralyzed me, and I knew my chances of surviving were slim. I was sure I wouldn't make it out. Their movements were too fast and coordinated. They reminded me of wolves circling their prey before the final strike. One of them stood on its hind legs again, like a person, and looked me straight in the eyes. It was unnatural. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, and at that moment I realized these weren't just animals. I screamed. Desperately, loudly, hoping someone would hear, but no one answered. I was alone, on that dark forest road, surrounded by creatures that seemed more like something from a nightmare than real animals. They began to close in, tightening the circle around me. My body was on fire with pain. The claws that had ripped into my shoulder and legs had left deep, jagged wounds. I could feel the blood running down my body, but the fear and adrenaline kept me from passing out. And then something unexpected happened. One of them, the biggest one, who seemed to be the leader, stopped and turned its head as if it was listening to something. It growled softly, but the rest of the pack froze along with it. In that moment, I knew it was my only chance. I gathered all my strength, got to my feet, and limped toward the car. My head was throbbing from the pain and terror, but I moved as fast as I could. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and with trembling hands started the engine. Through the window, I could still see them. The pack stood in the darkness, watching me. Their silhouettes faded into the fog, but I knew they were there, and they could easily catch up to me if they wanted to. The tires screeched as I backed up and sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw them one last time. Some of the creatures were still standing on their hind legs, watching me as I drove off. I didn't understand why they hadn't chased me. Maybe something had stopped them. Or maybe they were just toying with me like a cat plays with a mouse, letting it go at the last moment. When I finally reached a nearby gas station, I jumped out of the car, shaking as I grabbed my phone. I called the police, but I couldn't even explain what had happened. Too much of it seemed unreal. Conclusion: Laura Bennett's testimony is the only account we have at this time. Police have sent an investigative team to the scene, but no traces were found except for the car with a punctured tire and blood on the asphalt. No animal or human tracks were discovered. Laura Bennett remains in critical condition, and her mental state requires monitoring. The investigation is ongoing. Story 9. The House. When we bought the house in the south of France, it felt like a dream come true. An old mansion surrounded by forests and hills, far from the noise of the city. No one had lived there for decades, and the house needed repairs. But that didn't bother us. My wife, Sarah, and I were certain this was the perfect place for a new chapter in our lives. At first, everything went well. We settled in, worked on the renovations, and enjoyed the nature around us. The neighbors were a bit reserved but friendly. They told us that the house had been empty for a long time, and no one wanted to live there because of old rumors. We didn't pay much attention to that, thinking it was just local folklore. But after a few weeks, strange things started happening. It began with small things. Objects disappearing from where we left them, the sound of footsteps at night, which we attributed to the old wooden floors. But one night, I woke up to a dull, thumping sound, like someone was walking down the hallway. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and headed toward the noise, but there was no one there. It was just a dream, Sarah said the next morning when I told her about it. I wanted to believe that, but the next day when we were both home, the footsteps came again. Sarah looked at me with concern, now realizing that these weren't just random noises. We searched the house but found nothing unusual. Each day, things got worse. At night we heard whispers, doors closed by themselves, and once I even saw a shadow running through the garden. It felt as if the house was starting to wake up, like something ancient and forgotten was stirring inside. One morning, Sarah found an old door to the basement that we hadn't noticed before. It was locked with a rusty padlock. We assumed it was just another old storage room. I grabbed some tools to break the lock. When the lock finally gave way and the door swung open, a strange feeling enveloped us. An unnatural cold that seemed to defy the warm summer day. Inside the basement, there was nothing but pitch darkness, as if the light from our flashlights couldn't penetrate more than a few feet. I couldn't explain why. But something inside me screamed that we shouldn't go down there. We stood at the entrance, hesitating. The cold coming from the darkness chilled us to the bone, even though it was a hot day outside. It was as if the space below was resisting our presence. Sarah gripped my hand, her eyes filled with the same unease I felt deep inside. "Maybe we shouldn't," she whispered, stepping back. But something about that basement drew me in. Like the answer to all the strange events we had experienced over the past weeks was hidden inside. I took the flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped in. Sarah followed, still holding my hand. As we descended the narrow staircase, the air became thick and stale, like in places long abandoned. On the walls, strange symbols were carved, ancient markings I had never seen before. Sarah shone her light on them, and her face went pale. "These look like old Celtic symbols," she said. "But I've never seen them in this form." The room below turned out to be much larger than we expected. This wasn't just a typical basement for storing things. In the center stood a stone table covered with ancient, dusty artifacts. Metal masks, strange carved figures resembling wolves and humanoid creatures. Circles and lines had been etched into the floor around the table, as if someone had once conducted an ancient ritual here. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered. But before I could answer, a strange sound enveloped us. It wasn't the footsteps or whispers we had heard earlier. This was something else. Like the earth itself around us was beginning to tremble. The light from our flashlights flickered, and I felt panic slowly rising in my chest. "We need to get out of here," I said, feeling that staying any longer would be dangerous. We rushed toward the exit, but as soon as Sarah stepped onto the stairs, the door above slammed shut with a thunderous crash, as if it had been forcibly closed. We both froze, unsure of what to do. The darkness in the basement thickened, and it felt like the shadows around us started to move. Suddenly, I saw one of the figures on the wall begin to shiver and slowly stretch into the air. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered, clutching onto me. "It can't be real." I dashed toward the door, desperately trying to open it. The lock was sturdy but not bolted. It just wouldn't budge. I pounded on it with my fists, yelling, trying to break it off its hinges, but nothing worked. The noise in the basement grew louder, and now I could see more shadows moving around us, their movements becoming more distinct and threatening. In desperation, I grabbed an iron bar lying against the wall and began hitting the door. Then suddenly it opened, with a screech, as if it had been held shut by some force that didn't want to let us go. We burst outside, gasping for air, as if we had just emerged from underwater. The basement fell silent again, as though nothing had ever happened. We slammed the door shut and blocked it with whatever we could find in the house. Sarah said nothing, her face pale and terrified. I was in shock too. This wasn't just an old house with eerie sounds. There was something more. Something ancient and malevolent that had awakened with our arrival. After we closed the basement door, a heavy silence hung over the house. Sarah and I sat in the kitchen, trying to process what had just happened. Fear lingered in the air, refusing to let go. Every noise, whether it was the creak of the floorboards or the rustle of the wind outside, made us jump. "We have to leave," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever that was, we can't stay." I nodded. This house was a mistake, and we both knew it, but something was holding me back. There was a feeling that we hadn't fully understood what was happening. Like there was a key to solving this somewhere here. But what? The symbols, the underground room, the figures on the walls. It all seemed like part of something much bigger. The next morning, I decided to head into the nearest town to find out more about the history of the house. The local library was small, but they had an archive of old documents about the village and the surrounding area. I skimmed through a few old newspaper clippings when one article caught my eye. The headline read, "The Missing Lambert Family. Mystery of the mansion's owner's disappearance." It was about our house. According to the article, in the late 19th century, the Lambert family, who lived in this house, suddenly vanished. The father, mother, and 2 children disappeared without a trace, and their bodies were never found. Rumors spread throughout the village. Some spoke of ritualistic murders, others of a curse placed on the house. The article also mentioned strange symbols found on the walls after their disappearance, symbols like the ones we had seen in the basement. I returned home, feeling like we had stepped into the middle of something dark and ancient. Sarah was waiting for me on the porch, her eyes red from crying. "We need to leave," she said as soon as I approached. "Last night, the sounds... I heard whispers from the basement. We can't stay here." I didn't want to argue. Our lives were clearly in danger. We began packing, preparing to leave the house, when suddenly we heard a loud crash coming from the basement. We both froze. It wasn't an ordinary sound. It was too loud, as if something heavy was moving down there. I grabbed a flashlight and a knife and headed toward the basement door. Sarah didn't want to let me go, but I knew we had to finish this. We had to understand what was hiding in this house. When I opened the door, the cold hit me again. As I descended the stairs, I noticed something had changed. In the center of the room, on the same stone table, lay an object that hadn't been there before. An old, ancient book. Sarah joined me, her face tense. I opened the book, and on the first page was the same symbol we had seen on the walls. The pages were written in an unknown language, but one word kept repeating. "Gate." "What does it mean?" Sarah whispered. But the answer came on its own. At that moment, the walls of the basement began to tremble, and the figures on them started moving again. They became clearer, as if they were stepping out of the stone. Shadows thickened around us, taking the form of creatures with long limbs and glowing eyes. "Run!" I shouted. We sprinted toward the stairs, but the shadows were already chasing us. They moved faster than we could have imagined, filling the space around us. When we reached the exit, Sarah managed to slam the door shut, and at that moment, everything went silent. The strange whispers, the footsteps, the trembling, it all stopped as if by magic. We ran out of the house, not looking back. I threw the car keys into the ignition and we drove away, not considering for a second that we might ever return. This house was cursed, and whatever we had awakened within its walls was something that should have stayed, forgotten forever. Story 10. The Past. My brother and I arrived at our grandfather's house after he had passed away. The old mansion stood on the outskirts of a small town in Scotland, surrounded by forest and hills. This place had always given me strange feelings, even as a child. The house was massive, with tall stone walls and narrow windows that barely let any light in. We had to go through his belongings and decide what to do with the house. We weren't sure if we wanted to stay here. When we entered the house, the air was musty and cold, despite it being summer. Dust covered the furniture and the floorboards creaked beneath our feet. My brother was the first to speak. "Dark place, isn't it? Strange that Grandpa stayed here all alone." I nodded. The house had always felt alien to me, especially when I was younger. We rarely visited, but every time we spent the night here, it was filled with odd sounds, like someone whispering behind the walls or tree branches scratching the glass, even when it was calm outside. We began sorting through his things, mostly old books, dusty documents and souvenirs he had collected on his travels. But one room, which we hadn't entered for years, was locked. I remembered how Grandpa had forbidden my brother and me from going in there when we were kids. Now, with him gone, I felt like we needed to know what had been hidden behind that door. We found an old key in one of the boxes in the attic. It was large, like something from the last century. As I inserted it into the keyhole, I felt a strange unease. The door slowly creaked open, revealing our grandfather's study. The room was cold and empty. Shelves lined the walls, packed with old books, and papers lay scattered on the desk. But what caught our attention was a large mirror standing against the wall. Its frame was made of dark wood, carved with strange designs, It looked as old as the house itself. "Why did he keep this mirror here?" my brother asked, stepping closer. I didn't know. It looked eerie, but something about it drew my gaze. We stood in silence, staring at our reflections. Suddenly, I thought I saw the room behind us shift slightly. The shadows reflected in the mirror moved strangely, as if they had a life of their own. "Did you see that?" I asked, but my brother just shrugged. I stepped away from the mirror. Something wasn't right. My brother and I decided it was time for a break and left the room, leaving the door open. That night I locked it, but something inside me whispered that there was more to this room than we could understand. The next morning my brother and I felt exhausted, as if we hadn't slept at all. Something unsettling was gnawing at me, and I couldn't shake the image of that mirror in the study from my mind. At breakfast, I noticed my brother looked just as troubled as I felt. "Did you sleep badly too?" I asked, pouring myself some coffee. He nodded, silently staring out the window. The shadows of the trees outside seemed longer than usual, even though it was morning. It felt as if the house itself was affecting us, as though it was absorbing our thoughts and fears. "I had a strange dream," my brother finally spoke. "I was standing in that study in front of the mirror, and someone was behind me. I couldn't turn around, but I felt them watching me. I tensed. I had almost the same dream, but I didn't tell him right away. Our dreams could have just been the result of exhaustion and stress. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. "Maybe we need a distraction, take a trip to town," I suggested, hoping to escape the house, even if only for a few hours. But, as luck would have it, a heavy storm started that day, forcing us to stay inside. The rain pounded against the windows, and the shadows grew thicker. I felt the tension rising with every passing minute. Again, my thoughts drifted back to the study in the mirror. By evening, unable to take it anymore, I suggested to my brother that we go back to that room and see what else was hidden there. He reluctantly agreed, but I could tell that same feeling of strange unease was gnawing at him too. We entered the study again, and our footsteps echoed in the silence. The mirror seemed darker, its surface almost opaque, as if it were swallowing the light. I stepped closer and saw our reflection once again. But something was off. The shadows around us in the mirror were moving, even though there was no movement in the room. "This is madness," my brother whispered, but he didn't step back. I couldn't look away. It felt as if the mirror was drawing us in, completely capturing our attention. And suddenly I noticed it. In the reflection behind us, a figure appeared. A person? No, something else. Its outline was blurry, but it was clearly standing behind us, motionless, as if waiting for something. "Do you see that?" I asked quietly, not taking my eyes off the mirror. My brother slowly nodded. We both stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The figure stayed in place, but its presence was too real to be just a trick of the light. At that moment, the light in the room flickered, and the room in the mirror began to change shape. The walls disappeared, and instead of the study, we saw a dark corridor stretching into the distance. The figure in the mirror took a step forward, coming closer to us. In terror, I recoiled from the mirror, and my brother did the same. We both knew this wasn't a hallucination. It was something real, and it was waiting for us in that room, hiding in the shadows. We both ran out of the study, slamming the door behind us. Once in the hallway, I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My brother wasn't in much better shape. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with fear. "What was that?" he managed to say, struggling to find the words. "That can't be real." "I don't know," I replied, trying to control the rising panic. "But something is very wrong with this house." We stood in silence for a few minutes, not knowing what to do next. Our thoughts raced, but there was no clear plan. Going back into the study seemed insane, but I felt like we couldn't just leave without understanding what was going on. "We need to destroy that mirror," my brother suddenly said. "That's the key to everything. We won't be able to live in peace until we get rid of it." His words made sense, but the thought of returning to that room made me shudder. Still, I knew we had no other choice. The mirror was the source of all the evil in the house, and as long as it existed, we were under its power. I grabbed a heavy hammer from the garage and slowly headed back to the study. My brother followed, his face determined, but his hands were trembling. We both knew it was dangerous, but we had no other option. When we entered the study, the room felt different. The air was thick, as if the house itself resisted our presence. The mirror stood in its place, but now its surface was completely black. There was a strange silence emanating from it, as if it were absorbing all the sound around us. "Hurry," my brother whispered. I raised the hammer, ready to strike the frame, but at that moment the mirror changed again. Its surface rippled like water, and figures began to emerge from its depths. This time they were closer, and I realized it wasn't just a reflection. It was something more. Shadows coming from another world. I hesitated for a moment, and my brother shouted, "Do it now!" I brought the hammer down with all my strength, shattering the frame. The glass couldn't hold, cracking loudly, and the shadows inside the mirror seemed to dissolve into the air. A wind rose in the room that couldn't have been real. It felt as if everything around us was falling apart. But the moment the shards of the mirror scattered across the floor, everything went still. The silence that followed was deafening and ominous. We stood, staring at the broken mirror, not quite believing it was over. "Is that it?" my brother asked, breathing heavily. I wasn't sure. It felt like the power that had been hiding in the house disappeared along with the mirror. For the first time in a long while, I felt the tension lift. We left the study, closing the door tightly behind us. This time, for good. A few days later, we packed our things and left. We didn't sell the house. We simply decided that it should remain locked and forgotten. We both knew it was no longer meant for the living. Maybe the mirror was truly destroyed. Maybe we freed the house from its dark secret. But sometimes when I go to sleep, I hear faint footsteps or see shadows at the corner of my eye. And in those moments, I can't shake the feeling that whatever we awoke in that house is still watching us.